This works? Yes, sounds like it does now. Good morning, everyone. Before we begin, I want to thank you for all your encouragement, all your feedback. I do appreciate it. This morning I showed up, put my microphone on, and I got even more encouragement along the lines of teaching again. So yes, I am teaching again, but Lord willing, on Wednesday, Scott will teach. So, only 35 more minutes or so before you get to hear Scott finally. So, please open your Bibles to Matthew chapter 5. That's where we were on Wednesday. And if you've been doing your reading, as we said last Sunday, about 15 verses a day, a few minutes, by now you probably are getting close, or you have read the Sermon on the Mount the first time around. So I hope you're learning on your own as well as from the class. And I hope that you'll keep doing the reading every week. Read the Sermon on the Mount one time. It's only 3 chapters. So it doesn't take very long if you split it on a daily basis. And even if you spend some time reflecting on it and maybe pondering the things that we may have said in class, that may help you, hopefully, as well. Last time we began talking about the Beatitudes, and we said that the Beatitudes are really describing one unique character, and so there is one unique reward that goes with it. And we did the example of the house. If you tell me, come to my house on Friday for dinner, you're just talking about your house. I know where to go. But now if you're hiring me as your builder to build a house, then I will need a little bit more detail. And that's what Jesus is doing. He's describing the character of the people of God with several details from several different aspects, from several different perspectives. So just like you would tell your builder, I need the kitchen to be like this is the color of the cabinet, and then the living room, and then I need 4 bedrooms and 2.5 bathrooms and 3-car garage and whatever else, then Jesus is giving detail about what he expects and requires of the people of God. And we compare that to what Paul describes as the fruit of the Spirit. Singular, one. There's only one, but it manifests itself in several different ways with all those traits that Paul describes in Galatians chapter 5, verses 22 and 23. So it's, again, one, but it manifests itself as different ways, in different ways. And so then we talked about kind of the structure of the Beatitudes. There are 8 statements, one of which at the end repeats itself. And I kind of expressed last Wednesday, it's more of a 7 plus 1 rather than 8, because the last Beatitude is very different from the previous 7, as we will see towards the end of class today. So we have, for example, the first Beatitude, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. So you have the blessed part, which we called the condition. Then we have the description of the character trait that Jesus is addressing in this particular statement. And then you have the goal or the reward. So it would be, in this case, yours is the kingdom of heaven, theirs is the kingdom of heaven. We described these goals as both in the now, as you can see there, there's a present tense statement, but also in the future, like the next Beatitude, blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. So you don't necessarily get the reward now, you don't get to the goal now, you will get there over time. Then we talked about the word blessed, which really translates as happy, fortunate, and it carries with itself a sense of fulfillment. And we described that, anyway, as a journey. And I use the example of when we are visiting my parents, we go visit in the mountains. So we start our trip about 150 miles, and we drive, and where we start our trip is flat. But then we start driving, and before you know it, about 50 minutes into it, we start seeing the first mountains. Are we there yet? No, we need to keep driving. We need to keep going. And so we are getting closer. There is that sense of I'm getting somewhere, but I'm not there yet. And I keep growing, I keep proceeding. And so the blessed comes a little bit at a time. It's not that God just says, hey, you have been trying, good job, medal for trying. No, we are getting to do a little bit at a time, kind of like, when you go on vacation, you start traveling and you look forward to when you're going to get there, but you're also getting closer a little bit at a time. And then we start seeing a little bit of a landscape of what it's going to look like when we get there. And then finally we get to the last few miles of driving, and now we can see the landmarks of when we get there, but we're still traveling, we're still proceeding, we're still growing, and then finally we get there. And so it's not that we are not blessed anymore because now we have the reward. Now we are fully blessed because we are we have that fulfillment, that sense of finally being a lot closer to what God wants us to be, rather than where we first began. And there's that passage in Proverbs that we mentioned about the righteous person, that the light keeps growing from the morning till it's full. So there's that progress that goes on as we work towards these goals, achieving these character traits. And last time we talked about the first 4 Beatitudes, which at the end of class will specify how they work into the second half of the Beatitudes that we're going to look at today. And I'm doing all this so that we get a fuller appreciation of the context that we're going to look at today. But we talked about the poor in spirit, those that are just realizing who they are without God. And so you realize your need for God, and everybody has a need for God. There is no person on this earth that can just claim to be, hey, I'm fine, I don't need anybody. They may claim to say that, but they don't really have that. There is no perfect human being that you will ever meet in your life. We need to realize that. That makes a big difference. Before we can do anything else, we can do any more growth, we need to realize where we start. And this is where we start. And so we go on and we realize the problem of sin. Sin in general, but especially what sin has done to us. And so we mourn the natural consequence of realizing where we stand, who we really are, without all the things that we can enjoy today, the things that we think make us so safe, so secure. Then we see that we really are nothing. And sin is a big problem in our lives. And that humbles us. We become meek, we become gentle, we become humble, because we realize now by ourselves cannot do anything, cannot get there. We need help. We need to seek help. And so we start hungering and thirsting for righteousness. The righteousness that is the righteousness of God. As Jesus himself will say a few verses later when he talks about the righteousness that he expects from his people need to surpass the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees. It's not the righteousness of, hey, I've done this right, check mark. I've done this other thing right, mark it off the list. No, it's a righteousness that is deep in our hearts. And as we talked about the verb that is used there, those who hunger for righteousness and thirst for righteousness. The word hunger there is the same word of Jesus becoming hungry after being in the wilderness for 40 days and 40 nights, not eating and being tempted by the devil. And so we move on to the second part of the context. We're going to read all the Beatitudes again, just so that we try as much as possible to make them familiar with ourselves. And so in verse 3, Matthew chapter 5, in verse 3, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the gentle, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. Blessed are those who have been persecuted for the sake of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people insult you and persecute you and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward in heaven is great, for in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. Before we get into verse 7, any comments, any questions? Perfect. All right, verse 7. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. Mercy is something that we don't deserve. You are not owed mercy. That's actually the very definition of mercy. You're given mercy when you least deserve it. You should be punished, but you're not. You deserve punishment, but instead you get something else that is better than punishment. That is mercy. That is something that is given when we least deserve it. We don't deserve mercy, but God has given us mercy. And so we don't give mercy so that we can receive mercy. We give mercy, we are merciful because we already received mercy. God has sent His Son to die for us. That is the mercy that God has given us. And so now, we don't have a choice, if you will. We have a moral obligation of being merciful ourselves because we have been given mercy, because God has been merciful towards us. And so, really, we don't have a choice. We do have a choice. We can choose not to be merciful, but if you really want to be honest with the situation and realize what God has given us, then we really don't have a choice but to be merciful. You remember the parable in Matthew 18 that Jesus tells about that servant. In Matthew 18:21 and following, that servant that is forgiven 10,000 talents worth of a debt that he owed his master in Matthew 18. I don't know exactly how much it is to, the exchange rate today, but it is definitely in the billions of dollars with a B. He says, hey, I'll repay you. He's desperate. He's talking out of desperation. He knows that he cannot ever repay a debt that big. But he says, I'll repay you. I'll do whatever I need. And the master is merciful towards this servant and says, you're forgiven. But then this very servant that's been forgiven goes out and sees another fellow servant who owes him 100 denarii. Maybe, a third of the year worth of our wages. And now, instead of remembering the mercy he has received, he just goes to that servant and says, you got to pay me. You have to pay me. Pay me back now. And so the master, the one that forgave the first servant, now hears about it, and that mercy is erased, if you will, is removed. That servant, we all realize, should have been merciful. In proportion, 100 denarii is nothing. His pocket change compared to 10,000 talents that he had been forgiven. And that's how we are. We've been forgiven so much, but at the same time, we are so unwilling many times to be merciful ourselves. Mercy shows compassion, shows that we care, shows that we have a heart that is more like what God expects from us. Mercy is also a driving force in spreading the gospel, because you want people to receive the same thing that we have received. You want people to know what we know, what we have, what we can have access to, and it's not something, hey, it's a secret, don't tell anybody, and that's why we're streaming it online as well, right? We want everybody to know, we want everybody to have access to that mercy, but at the same time, we become responsible for sharing a little bit of what we have received, and so we have to be merciful ourselves. And that's a natural consequence of someone that becomes righteous, someone that hungers and thirsts for righteousness, because, again, you realize what we have access to. You realize what God expects, and so we try to be like God, and we try to be the same as He has done. Any comments or questions? Rebukes? Rotten vegetables you brought, just... I guess you weren't sure who was teaching today, so, but that's why we don't share the schedule anyway. All right, verse 8. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Let me ask you this. What is purity? We talked about the springs of the water, and how the people that sell you the water want you to know how pure their water is. Why is that? What is purity? Yeah, it's not contaminated, it's unadulterated. What if I put 4 drops of motor in every water bottle that I sell? You start being able to tell, right? Because it starts having that deposit. See, wait a second, what is that dark thing in my water bottle? And that's why audits are done, to monitor purity, because you want to make sure there is nothing there that does not belong. In the spiritual realm, purity is the ability of having a dedicated, single-minded will to do God's expectations, to obey God, to follow Him, to love Him, to please Him. There's nothing else that interferes with it. There's nothing else that tries to take its place. There's nothing else that we want to compromise with. We just are fully devoted to God's will. We are pure in heart. One of the things that Jesus says in Matthew chapter 15 may give us a little bit of an idea as to that purity that Jesus expects. Matthew chapter 15, and we may also, think of several different verses when we think of purity. James 4, purify your hearts, you double-minded, don't have any pollution in you. But Jesus says, when it comes to purity, Matthew chapter 15, in verse 11, he makes this statement. Matthew 15, verse 11, it is not what enters into the mouth that defiles the man, but what proceeds out of the mouth that defiles the man. And then you skip down to verse 15, and Peter said to him, explain the parable to us. And so Jesus said, are you still lacking in understanding also? Do you not understand that everything that goes into the mouth, talking about foods that would have been unclean, passes into the stomach and is eliminated? Verse 18, but the things that proceed out of the mouth come from the heart, and those defile the man. For out of the heart come evil thoughts, murders, adulteries, fornications, thefts, false witnesses, slanders. These are the things which defile the man, but to eat with unwashed hands does not defile the man. If my heart is clean, people can tell. If I have other interests besides serving God, pleasing Him, and doing what He wants and what He expects, and showing Him that I love Him, if there is something else in my heart, then people can tell. It's visible because it comes out of my heart. It's visible eventually. Maybe not right away sometimes, but it's visible eventually. You can tell where my loyalty is. In later in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus in Matthew chapter 6 in verse 24 says, no one can serve 2 masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and wealth. In Matthew 6:24. You cannot have your loyalty to 2 different places. I'm a dual citizen. I'm a citizen of Italy. I'm a citizen of the United States. Both countries allow you to be citizen of the other country. But in that country, you are a citizen of that country. So here, I'm a citizen of the United States. And only in very small circumstances is my Italian citizenship brought up. In Italy, I'm an Italian citizen. And so in very little circumstances is my U.S. citizenship brought up. And you don't have to renounce citizenships when you you are naturalized. But there are some countries that actually do. And so I remember at the naturalization ceremony, there were a couple of people from China. China does not allow you to have dual citizenship. That's more like, sorry for the metaphor, but that's more like how God works. He does not want you to be a citizen of the kingdom of heaven, as well as having your heart somewhere else. He says, if you want to follow me, you have to give up everything else to follow me. You have to give up your loyalty wherever else it is. You cannot serve God and wealth, but you cannot serve God and fill in the blank. You can only serve God from a pure heart. Otherwise, it becomes very hard to serve God. When we put family at the same level, when we put work at the same level, when we put material things at the same level, a hobby at the same level, a talent, it becomes really hard to serve God from a pure heart, because God says, you have to be mine and mine only. You have to give yourselves to me. You are my people. That's kind of what he has been saying all along. But as you recall from last Sunday, the people of God were just trying to be like the nations. They wanted to be like everybody else out there. And the temptation for us is very strong, to be like everybody else out there. And like somebody said, you can, build a puzzle of all the good things that, so-and-so is very talented in this, and so-and-so is very wealthy, and so-and-so is very good at their job, and so-and-so is very successful. And so you can build a puzzle of all the things that you like in everybody, and you want to be like everybody, but everybody else has their problems too. One of which, if we just look at the world, is that they are without God. They don't have Jesus helping them. And so God expects us to be devoted to him, to be single-mindedly devoted to him, to have a heart that is not polluted with anything else. And so we move on to verse 9. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. Purity is necessary. Purity in heart, as he talks about in verse 8, is necessary to see God. And as we become merciful, we become more detached from our fleshly self as we become more like God. And so we become cleaner, if you will, from our fleshly self, and then we start being more like God. Peacemaking is one of the most important activities that God has ever done. Without the sacrifice of Jesus, we can only experience the wrath of God, the punishment of God. Jesus sent his Son so that we could be at peace with God. Besides all those verses that talk about, our need to be proactive in peace and helping peace, even though I realize sometimes we don't want to compromise other very important principles from the scriptures, but so far as it depends on you, be at peace with everybody, says Paul. And in Colossians chapter 1, Colossians chapter 1, in verse 20, Paul, in Colossians chapter 1, let's start in verse 19. Colossians chapter 1 in verse 19. Colossians 1:19, he says, "For it was the Father's good pleasure for all the fullness to dwell in him," talking about Christ, "and through him to reconcile all things to himself, having made peace through the blood of his cross. Through him, I say, whether things on earth or things in heaven." He has made peace through the sacrifice of Jesus. The sacrifice of Jesus is what allows us to be at peace with God, so we don't have to experience the consequences of our sin. The price is paid, and now we can enjoy relationship with God. And so again, we have to work on being peacemakers. Is it easy to make peace with somebody sometimes? Only they come to me and seek forgiveness and realize that they are way mistaken then, right? That's usually how it goes. Well, if so-and-so realizes that they made a mistake and blah, blah, and condition, blah, 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 then it's easy to make peace. Most of the time, still. But is it really easy to make peace with somebody? That's a lot of work. It requires humility. It requires taking our pride and setting it aside. It requires realizing that we are not perfect, which we don't really like to be reminded, right? You realize that, again, we've been given a lot more than we could ever give ourselves. And so we owe. And so the least that we can do is to make peace. Let me ask you this, and this is one of those questions where you really need to read my mind. And what is easier when it comes to being a peacemaker? What is easier than making peace? Is there anything that you can think of when it becomes, when things get difficult, when peace is required? Is there anything that you can think of that it's easier than making peace? Something simpler, something that wouldn't require so much of an effort. Come on, you can read my mind. Yes, that's a fleshly side. So, you can just, there goes that relationship. I'll never talk with them again. That's much easier, that's simpler, that's how the world works, right? You are removed from my friends list, and let me go right away on Facebook and defriend you, so everybody will know. Yes, you can always, for the rest of your life, you can go on and always bring that thing up. I remember in 1976 when that thing happened 45 years ago. When it comes to being the people of God, one thing is easier than making peace when it comes to really reflecting what God expects us to do. One thing that is easier than making peace is keeping peace. Before things spiral down and everything falls apart and crashes and burns, there's a lot we can do to prevent that from happening. And again, we don't have to sacrifice the principles that we believe are true from the Word of God to do that. Sometimes we just have to say, hey, I tried everything, but this is as far as I can go, because God does not want me to compromise with some of the things that may be going on in the situation where we're trying to make peace. But on the fleshly side, it's easier to just say, yeah, forget that one. I'll just be, hold a grudge with you for the rest of my life. But from the spiritual standpoint, it's a lot easier to keep peace, to keep things from happening where then we have to make peace. Any comment, any question? Yes, sir, yeah. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Thank you. Yeah, Mr. Krafts was saying, in Romans 12, verse 18, Paul has that expression of as far as you can control the situation, if you will, be at peace with all men. And sometimes there is only so much you can do. But as far as it involves you, as far as you have a power to do something, be at peace with all men. And so, you have to kind of do what God does. You have to forget and set aside the sins that we've committed. And you have to set aside that thing happened so you can be at peace. Sometimes before things, really become to the point of where then we have to make peace, then sometimes we have to become humble. We have to say, you know what? I've contributed to the situation, maybe, whatever the situation is, but it requires thirst for righteousness. It requires us to be meek and gentle. It requires us to be pure in heart. It requires us to be more like God. As Jesus didn't really, object to coming, to living as one of his own creatures for a few decades, and then for doing all that he has done. I like how here, just like in verse 8, he says the pure will see God. And then the peacemakers, they shall be called sons of God. It seems like he's getting closer and closer to that relationship with God where, hey, if you're pure in heart, purity, holiness, God is holy. That is an echo that goes on and on and on throughout the scriptures. God is holy. Holiness is the language that God speaks. And so it requires holiness from us as well to be able to relate to him. And so then, when we become peacemakers, when we get to the point of being more like God, then we become more like his sons. I really like, and I know I mentioned Italy at least a couple times every lesson, but I really like going to Italy this past summer with our 3-year-old son, our 1.5-year-old daughter, because many reasons, but one of them was that when we got to church, the people at church there who had known me all my life looked at my 3-year-old son and said, "Hey, he looks like you." And I was so happy because here I don't get that very much. And you may know who my son is, and you may think, "Lorenzo, what happened to you?" And then you may think, is it going to happen to him as well? But I have proof in pictures that when I was a 3-year-old, I looked a lot more like he does today. Because he's my son. And when we are like God, then we are his children as well. And then there is a last beatitude where Jesus switches gears a little bit, and now it's not just something to achieve and pursue. Now it's something that almost is the consequence of everything else he's been talking about. So in verses 10 through 12, it just makes the statement twice. And as he does in other places in the Sermon on the Mount, we don't have to do it in this class, but we have to pay attention when Jesus offers his own commentary of something that he says. He says something and then he explains something, and so it must be meaningful. Blessed are those who have been persecuted for the sake of righteousness. That righteousness that he even talked about in verse 6. For theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Again, that statement that he uses in verse 3 to kind of frame that character that he expects his people to be. Blessed are you when people insult you and persecute you and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. And maybe we're not in that place yet, but sometimes people see or have known us for a long time, and so they remember who we were and how we acted and how we talked, and then they say, "Hey, you're different. Something changed." And that's when we realize that these things are working in us. When people can see that we are different, and sometimes our righteousness and the world's righteousness is not the same. Our principles, our values, and what the world values, kind of like Isaiah says, they call evil good and good evil. Is that kind of a summary of what happens even today? And so Jesus says, if you do all these things, what you can expect is, on one side, they're going to be persecuted. On one side, people are not going to like you because you've changed. That change that we talked about in the first lesson. But then at the same time, in verse 12, rejoice and be glad, for your reward in heaven is great. In the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you, and in the same way are going to do to Jesus in just a couple of years, 3 more years from that time. The world does not like the people of God. Yeah, we are all fine and good. We're all good neighbors to the people in the world. But ultimately, when we start living by God's principles and bringing out those things that Scott, Lord willing, will talk about in verses 13 through 16 in the next class, when those start to come out, then the people in the world are exposed. And so either they're interested and want to know what's going on and why we're like that, or most of the time they just dismiss us. And maybe it becomes, so-and-so is a good person, but they have this thing. They behave in this certain way, or they don't do these other things, or they don't talk like that. And so to summarize in the last couple of minutes that we have, the Beatitudes in just one snapshot, the first 4 talk about our inner character. They focus on who we are and how we focus on heart, our personality, and how we need to change that, and how that changes how we act socially, if you will, our social character, our outward character. And so as we transform ourselves inside, then that is visible as we relate to others. That is visible as we live our daily lives and we interact with other people. And so you have all these things that happen in the first 4 verses, and some of them also in the latter verses that we read today, that influence how we interact with everybody. And that is visible, and sometimes that causes the persecution, and to different degrees, of course, that we see in verses 10 to 12. Any last comments or questions? Or yes, sir. Yeah.
Peace stops with the other person. Oh, now I can do whatever. No, let's start the peacemaker. You keep on going with the peace on your part. Attempt to keep peace or deal peace. You don't ever stop.
Yes, sir. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, Mr. Bryan was talking about how if somebody else stops with their, even with their effort, then we just keep going. We just keep doing it. Or we, that one time I got burned trying to do this. No, we just keep living like that. It doesn't, is not, we don't have any exceptions. There's no, little asterisk in our verse and says, well, in this situation, this doesn't qualify. It's always effective. Anything else? All right, thank you so much.